Howdy, everybody. Welcome back to Humanities 4, Shasta College, Film Studies. Hope your weekend was interesting, enjoyable. Spring is happening. It is starting later, and so we're coming out of the winter doldrums and into the bright new sunshine of a new day, spring. And have patience on your last essays. I haven't even started grading them yet, but I'm going to get to them this week. We're going to have a quiz next week before we have our Easter break, so that's something to look forward to. But this week, I'm going to assign another essay. It'll be essay number 5, and I'm going to talk about. I've spoken about these directors already, except for one I haven't. I'm going to talk about him. And what's happening now in our studies, we're about chapter 8 now, if you're following along in your book, your textbook, which covers a lot of ground. It covers ground that I don't cover because we don't have time for it, and it goes way outside of the Hollywood, normal films from Hollywood, and because world cinema is really starting to catch fire in the 60s. We're in the 60s, folks. And because of film festivals around the world and students are studying film in college now for the first time, things are really popping when it comes to world cinema. And these filmmakers I'm going to talk about a little bit tonight are all definitely the product of that. Hollywood has kind of lost its way. They're struggling to keep their audience, and the audience is young. And young people aren't seeing anything they can relate to up on the screen. Hollywood is still trying to crank out some cranky, kind of old style Hollywood fantasy type films, and it's not really working for the new audience, which is a young audience, which is looking for heroes and directors and writers that reflect what they're going through. Like if you wrote about On the Waterfront or Rebel Without a Cause, that's the youth market. And Hollywood still hasn't learned anything yet, that the youth market is boiling. At the end of this week, I'll be getting way more into that than I am tonight, because right now we're still in the very early stages of the early 60s. Everything changes in a couple years, not only in music, but in cinema. But today we're right before that change is happening, and Hollywood is trying to figure out what people want to see, and so they're making sort of big epic films like Cleopatra, which bankrupted Paramount Studios at one time. It was considered the highest budgeted film in the history of films. I think it was $6 million. That was a lot of money in those days. Nothing now, of course. $6 million is a small little independent film now. And it was considered bloated and full of excess, and movie stars getting $1 million checks. Elizabeth Taylor starred in it, and she got a $1 million paycheck. It's the first time in history. These actors were starting to demand and get $1 million a movie. Now that's almost like the smaller parts of the movie get that much, or TV series. But in 1963, which is almost 57 years ago, 58 years ago, is serious money. Well, it's bankrupting Hollywood because the movies aren't making the money back. And we also are strapped. We've got this censorship board that's watching all the films, have to approve the scripts. And so we're still not using the 4-letter words yet. We're still not saying all the F-bombs and everything we say now. But they're starting to do that in Europe because they don't have the same kind of censorship that we do. And so a filmmaker, one of the greatest in the history of cinema, Ingmar Bergman, who's from Sweden and spent his entire career mostly there. Um, he directed at the in the theater, and he directed over his lifespan about 45 films. That's impressive. Um, he usually directed a film every summer, and then he would direct theater during the winter. And the winters in Sweden and Stockholm are long, folks. Um, and he directed maybe a dozen of the greatest films in the history of cinema. He started in the late 40s, but he didn't really find his footing that made him stand out from everybody else until he directed some later films in the late 1950s. One would be called the Seventh Seal, Strawberry. Strawberry. I forgot the name of it. Anyway, and they put him on the map at an international level. People really perked up. Then he made a series of films starting in about 1961 or so. And they mostly were based on his inner struggles with his faith and any kind of organized religion. And so with humans and their the fallacy of humanity, you might say. And he used a small group of actors in almost all of his films. They were definitely, he used them over and over again. Max von Sydow, who just died last year, Liv Ullmann, who's still alive, Bibi Andersson, many, many more. They star in all his movies. These are Swedish actors, although Liv Ullmann is from Norway, but she's speaking Swedish language with a Norwegian accent. And they were considered showing the struggle of man, his inner conflict. Bergman, when he was interviewed, said, all my films deal with three themes. One of them is love. One is them as unrequited love. And the other one is my confrontation with God. And that really kind of sums up a lot of those movies in a general way. And he started making films on this island of Faro, which he actually ended up buying property there and living there. That's where he lived the rest of his life, actually, and died. And he started filming movies on this island. It became a very there was no studios, there's nothing, but people stayed in cabins, and they worked during the summer, which the Swedish summer is short. The highs will be in the 70s. That was considered hot weather there. And you go swim in the Baltic Ocean, which is still cold, even in the summer. And he would make these movies. And the series of movies, I'm not going to list them all, but Winter Light, Through a Glass Darkly, Shame, Persona, Passion of Anna are just a few of them. And they are all individual films about people struggling with their place in the world. They're not high on comedy, folks. Bergman had a very complicated childhood. He was sickly. He had a lot of worries about health, mental health. Supposedly his father, who was pretty brutal, would lock him in a shed for days on end and wouldn't let him out. And so he had lots of fears of closed doors and dark spaces. And he whether it was exaggerated or not doesn't really matter, but he used it as fuel to fuel his films. He wrote the scripts. He would get the same crew together, the same group of actors, and they would go off every summer and make a film. And then during the winter, I told you he'd go back to directing theater. And he was a national treasure, not just in Sweden, but around the world. He became world renowned. He won the Academy Award a couple times for Best Foreign Film, and he was considered a master director, an auteur director. Remember, we mentioned auteur a couple weeks ago when I was talking about the French directors and how they describe a director who is an author of their own work as being somebody who's has a vision, is totally controlled uh, in the way the film looks and sounds and the themes. And you could spot them. If you watch an Alfred Hitchcock movie and you don't know who directed it, you can most likely guess that Alfred Hitchcock directed it by the style, by the photography, by the emotional content, by the themes. Same thing with, I talked about this last week with Billy Wilder, same thing with Orson Welles, John Huston. They all were considered auteur directors. But Hollywood doesn't really nurture the auteur directors. That's comes from European film directors and the French. It is their word after all. But Bergman would definitely be an auteur director. He is definitely the author of his own work. There's no other hands in that pot. He is the only hand stirring that pot. And it shows. There's a one unison vision in his films. My main complaint with modern films right now, current films coming out of Hollywood, is they're a mishmash of directors, producers, writers. I don't see a single vision. There are some filmmakers, we'll talk about this later. There are some filmmakers, absolutely, who have a singular vision. Quentin Tarantino would be a prime example. Christopher Nolan would be another one. Burton, who directed Edward Scissorhands and the Batman, would definitely be one of them. His style is very, you can see it as soon as you turn the movie on. Somebody like David Lynch, who you may not know, very distinct style in all his films. But is he out of fashion right now? He's not making any more movies. They're not at the mall. What's at the mall is the next X-Men sequel, next comic book sequel, directed by a director that gets the job done. They know how to do action. They know how to where to put the camera. But do they have a singular style that you could spot unless you saw the credits? The day of the auteur director, I believe, is over until something new happens. There are still some personal films being made, but it's hard to get a personal style and make a bunch of money off of it. It's still get financing for your next film, and that's what the game is right now in Hollywood. Bigger, 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 and more sequels, because that's what made money last year. They think that's what's going to make money this year, and they don't want to chance anything. So, but before that, Ingmar Bergman was working in a world that was accepting global directors, global vision, and his films got out in the world through film festivals all around the world. Berlin Film Festival, Venice Film Festival, then American Film Festival started up, Toronto Film Festival, and it wasn't until later on when the film festivals became so well known in this country, like Sundance and Telluride. That's a later lecture, not yet though. That comes way later, actually, in the 80s. So the festivals were pretty limited here, but like they were showing, like I mentioned there before, they were showing these films on college campuses. And so students were seeing these films. The students who were studying film history, or anything you study at the college, you go down to the movie theater Friday night, they're showing these movies. And so he was getting a reputation as being somebody to look for because he was so outside of Hollywood. His movies have very adult themes, very adult themes. And they have um, erotic overtones. They have nudity, folks. Um, but it's not done to titillate. It's done to look how people operate, not how people. Hollywood makes it. If you take your clothes off in Hollywood, you better be having some incredible superhuman sex because that's only in Hollywood do they have sex like that. The rest of us have to walk around looking like this. So we don't have that choice to to be that way, and so it's more of a fantasy than reality. And guys like Ingmar Bergman and Francois Truffaut from France were trying to deal with reality as much as they could, as much as they could see, as much as they have experienced. Um, Ingmar Bergman was such a visionary that it's hard to get um, your head around it, especially now. Like I told you, he thrived in the '60s and '70s. It was when he won his Academy Awards and he was on the international stage. He had many opportunities to come to Hollywood and get the big bucks, and he didn't go for it. He'd rather make his small films in Sweden on his own, has his own, and nobody telling him what to do. He controlled all of it. And that's really rare, especially in Hollywood when they give you so much money, they're not going to let you control it. They're going to watch the money. That's their main concern. Bergman's main concern was to do this story the best he knew how to do. And he didn't test his films with audiences. He released them as is. And sometimes they're not they don't have great endings. They don't have happy endings. They don't have the ending that Hollywood always provides because Hollywood doesn't want to ruffle feathers, and especially during this time. It's interesting what was going on in the world during this time. We're coming out of the conservative 50s now. We're within literally the same year a new president's been elected, John F. Kennedy, the youngest president ever up until that point. I think he was 48 at the time. He presented a new look at the power structure in this country, and it gave a lot of people hope. They called his reign and they referred to it as Camelot in Washington. If you know anything about Camelot, King Arthur's Camelot, it was a fictitious utopian kingdom. They made it into a very successful musical later on. But this is before Kennedy was assassinated, of course. That changed everything again, but not yet. Bergman was very forthcoming with his knowledge. He wasn't like a lot of American directors who didn't like to share their knowledge. He was a natural born teacher. I've read most of his books, and he's very detailed. And my dream was always to make my version of Ingmar Bergman movie. Maybe it's too late. Maybe not. Anyway, there's always time. So that's how important Bergman is. He died about 10 years ago. He lived a long life, productive life, had a wonderful existence, and his cabin, his estate on this island of Faro, which is in the Baltic Ocean, outside of Sweden, where he lived and he worked, is now open to the public a couple months a year. And you could wander the grounds. You can see the locations where they filmed this stuff. They have every June, I don't know if they're still doing it, but usually in June, they have a retrospective there. You pay a big fee to go there. It's been my dream to go there for the last couple of years. Haven't got there yet. Probably won't get there this year either because of the pandemic. It's not easy to get there either. You got to fly to Stockholm. You got to take a bus 30 miles to Stockholm. Then you got to take a ferry 30 miles out into the ocean. And there's one hotel. And so you better have it all planned out way in advance if you're going to have any sort of a good time. And you just usually rent bicycles because there's only 500 people or so live on this island, very few cars and very few roads. So Bergman felt free out there. He was away from the power structure in Sweden. He was a long way away from Hollywood, and he could do what he wanted. So he had complete artistic freedom, which is so a gift and so rare. All three of these directors had that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to move on. I already talked last week about Francois Truffaut. He was the French director who directed the 400 Blows, who believed in cinema like a religion. So did Bergman. He didn't live that long. He only lived to 52 or so. He had brain cancer and died early. But he did some incredible personal auteur type films, starting with 400 Blows, which is an incredible first film for anybody to do. Maybe you saw, I think I might have shown a little documentary or something. You could look at that. And the third one I want to talk about, and I think I mentioned him earlier, is Akira Kurosawa from Japan, who was making movies before World War II, but of course World War II stopped all that. They were the enemy of America. You're not going to make films. And he was too old to serve in the military, so he was essentially lived in Japan when it was being bombarded by bombers, and before they dropped the nuclear bomb on two of the cities there. But he was always in the back of his head wanting to create film, of course. And after the war was over, America occupied Japan for almost 10 years with martial law. And we had our military over there controlling things. And he started making films again. But he had to present his scripts to the powers that be, which was us, for approval, so that he couldn't have anything anti-American in the scripts. And so he started making films literally 1946 or so, and he never stopped until he died in the early 90s. But one of his films, I mentioned, I think already, The Seventh Samurai, about these samurais who were hired to defend a village from these marauding thieves. And there's only 7 of them against an army. And so it's beautiful black and white. He always used a lot of atmospheric elements like rain and wind. And he loved to move that camera. He loved to move those actors, and he loved to move hundreds of people on horseback, charging, and huge battle sequences. So it's really impressive. It changed the way we look at action films in this country. We remade it into a movie called Magnificent Seven, a Western with Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen. Very successful Western that came out in the early 60s. But nobody knew at the time that it was based on The Seventh Samurai, the same story, except for this is a Western set in Mexico, not in the feudal system of Japan. Same exact story, though. Copied everything. John Sturges, who directed that, who's a great director, who also directed The Great Escape, another wonderful action male-dominated film. And Bad Day at Black Rock, one of the great film noirs that came out of the late 50s also. So they remade it into a Western. Maybe you saw the remake. They just remade it again with Denzel Washington and Christopher Pratt. Magnificent Seven. Except for they kind of played a lot of it for ironic laughs. Anyway, Kurosawa loved to tell a story visually. They're talking Japanese, but you don't really need to even know what they're saying to get the story. He did wonderful versions of Yokimbo and Hidden Fortress, which I mentioned earlier was the basis of Star Wars. He did do some contemporary films, and I guess you would call it contemporary times. But he's mostly known for these period pieces. They didn't have an Old West there, but they had their version of the feudal system and warlords dominating the countrysides. And the samurais were considered what we would call gunfighters now, or hired guns. And so he made this wonderful movie, and it so impressed Hollywood, they just stole it, remade it into a Western, very, very successful Western. And we have been copying Kurosawa's magnificent epics like Ron, which he made in the 80s. We're still copying it. We still can't match it. Believe it or not, that's how good they are. That's how impressive and epic the stories are. I'm going to sign the fifth essay right now, and I'm going to give you a choice. I'll put this on the assignments, so don't worry. The details will be there. You can either write these are all 3 to 5 page essays, just what we've been doing, critical analysis, not a review, not a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or you didn't like the photography, you think the acting's no good. I'm looking at what makes this film work. Why? Why is the Seventh Samurai considered a game changer? Why? You don't have to be right on it. You could be wrong. You probably will be wrong, but maybe you'll surprise yourself and you might find the truth in there. Why is Persona considered such a masterwork of cinema? And it's I'm going to say this, very experimental. The first 5 minutes of this movie, nobody knows what's going on. And I've studied this movie. I know what's going on because I've read about it. But when you first see it, it's supposed to be discombobulating. It's not life, folks. It's cinema. So you can write a paper on Persona. You can write a paper on The 400 Blows, the French film by Truffaut. Or you can write a paper on The Seventh Samurai. It's up to you. Your choice, by Kurosawa. They're all on Canopy. You get that through Shasta College. And so it's all free. You don't have to pay for it. Shasta College pays for it. The budget for this department pays for it. They pay $5 every time they show a film. So you can get all 3 of those films on Canopy. I'll post it in assignments tonight and what I expect. Now, this will be the 5th essay. And so you're getting better. And so I'm getting harder on the grading. I'm not going to let things go that I normally would give you a warning on, like, okay, you're talking about your personal opinion here, meaning when I say personal opinion, that's different than your critical analysis. There is a huge difference. I don't like the way this film starts. Well, that's a personal opinion. That's not critical analysis. I think the black and white photography is boring. Okay, that's not analysis, that's personal opinion. Keep it out of the essay. And I'm going to get harder on that each essay we do. So that'll be due next Monday. You'll see it. I'll post it. You'll have plenty of time to watch these movies. I gave you guys a whole week to do this stuff. And you could be late by 3 days and still, so that's 10 days before you get 0 points. And I know we all have busy lives. We all have things going on, but we are in college and you should pay attention. And I would start watching the movie sooner than later, but you'd be surprised. Or you wouldn't be, because maybe you're one of those who won't start watching this movie until Sunday at midnight, this Sunday when it's due. the next day. I don't advise that, but if that's how you roll, that's how you roll. But the longer you think about the movie, the longer you let it sit on you, the better it will be. It's okay to do some research. That's expected. You should know something about the film and the filmmakers, but I want you to make sure you watch the film. I can usually tell if you've watched it or not because the telling is in the details. And some people just do a research paper, but that's not what the assignment is. And you'll lose some points on that if I don't feel you've watched it. And if I question you and you tell me you watched it, I'll believe you. It's just doesn't seem like some essays seem like they're just verbatim taken off research off the internet because the language is very general. It's not specific, and I can usually see, I can usually tell. I can be wrong, folks. Anyway, so those are the three films. Your choice, what you do. I'm going to, there'll be nothing more to sign this week. I'll be talking more uh, on movies that were coming into the mid 60s, and the youth market is going to start rocking and rolling. And until that time, remember, everything is cinema. I'll see you next time when the story of film continues.